Ardennes Forest, December 1944. Just after 0400 hours, the first artillery rounds began to fall, not in the sporadic, harassing pattern of typical night engagements, but with a concentrated fury that spoke of something far more significant than a probing attack. This was the opening salvo of an offensive designed to shatter the Allied lines, an assault that had been meticulously planned and, crucially, predicted by an unlikely source. The stakes were immediate and catastrophic. A breakthrough here meant the unraveling of the Western Front, a prolonging of the war, and a potential renegotiation of the entire European theater. For weeks leading up to this moment, a series of detailed intelligence dispatches had been flowing from Soviet military intelligence to their Western allies, specifically highlighting a substantial German armored buildup in the Ardennes. These reports, often dismissed or downplayed by American command, described not only troop concentrations, but also specific unit designations, estimated tank counts, and even the likely axes of advance. Captain Samuel Miller, an artillery battery commander with the 106th Infantry Division, had seen some of these summaries cross his desk, filed under unconfirmed foreign intelligence. His initial assessment, like many of his peers, leaned towards skepticism. The sheer audacity of a major German offensive through such terrain seemed improbable. The Soviet intelligence, gathered through a network of agents and frontline reconnaissance, spoke of panzer divisions being re-equipped and moved under the cover of darkness, their logistics trains stretching for miles. One report dated December 10th specified elements of the 5th Panzer Army, including the 2nd Panzer Division, positioning themselves for a thrust towards the Meuse River. This level of granular detail, particularly regarding the specific, battle-hardened panzer units, should have raised alarms, but the prevailing Allied narrative of a collapsing Wehrmacht and an exhausted German war machine fostered a dangerous complacency. The American intelligence apparatus, focused on its own collection methods and often distrustful of Soviet motives, found it difficult to reconcile these warnings with their own, less urgent assessments. The quantitative data provided by the Soviets was striking. Estimates of over 1,500 tanks and assault guns concentrated in an area previously considered unsuitable for large-scale armored operations. Production logs from captured German factories, later analyzed, confirmed a surge in Panther and Tiger tank output in late 1944, directly correlating with the Soviet reports of increased armored strength. The strategic implication was clear. Germany was not merely defending, it was preparing a massive counteroffensive. Yet the American gunners, including Miller's battery, remained in their static positions, their guns sighted for defensive actions against a retreating enemy, not an advancing armored juggernaut. The ideological chasm between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union, even as wartime partners, manifested in a deep-seated suspicion that undermined the credibility of these vital warnings. The American command, accustomed to its own sophisticated intelligence gathering, viewed the Soviet contributions through a lens of political expediency, often suspecting ulterior motives behind the shared data. This institutional bias, coupled with a genuine underestimation of German capabilities, left Miller and his men, unknowingly, on the precipice of a maelstrom. The intelligence dossier, thick with Cyrillic script and translated hastily by overworked signals officers, landed on Colonel Maxwell's desk with a thud that seemed to echo the weight of its contents. It detailed, with unnerving precision, the composition of Panzer Group 4, its recent movements through the shattered remnants of Army Group Center, and, most critically, its projected spearhead directly towards the American 3rd Armored Division's exposed flank. The Soviets, through their forward reconnaissance and captured German documents, estimated a force of at least 120 tanks, primarily Panzer IV Ausf H models, and a significant complement of Panther Ausf D variants, supported by 2 motorized infantry regiments. Maxwell, a veteran of North Africa and Sicily, had seen his share of exaggerated enemy reports. He leaned back, the springs of his field chair groaning in protest, and lit a cigarette. The Soviet assessment, while detailed, felt theatrical. Their intelligence, often filtered through layers of political expediency and a desperate need to impress their Western allies, had a reputation for hyperbole. A staff sergeant, fresh from a code-breaking course in Bletchley Park, had appended a note to the report highlighting a discrepancy in the reported number of heavy self-propelled guns, suggesting a potential 15% overestimation based on comparative analysis of previous Soviet reports versus confirmed engagements. The 3rd Armored was dug in along a defensible line, their M4 Shermans positioned to cover the main avenues of approach, and their M10 tank destroyers camouflaged in hull-down positions. Their intelligence, derived from aerial reconnaissance and limited forward patrols, indicated scattered German resistance, primarily rearguard actions. A recently captured German Feldwebel, interrogated for 72 hours, had spoken of severe fuel shortages and morale problems within the Wehrmacht, painting a picture of an army on the brink of collapse, not poised for a concentrated armored thrust. Maxwell's command had received similar warnings from the British 21st Army Group regarding localized German counterattacks, which had, in practice, amounted to little more than company-strength probes easily repulsed. The prevailing sentiment within the American High Command was that the German capacity for large-scale offensive operations had been decisively broken. Production logs from German heavy industry, intercepted and analyzed by Allied intelligence, showed a steady decline in tank output since mid-1944, reinforcing the belief that the Wehrmacht was bleeding out. The Soviet report, with its stark warnings of a formidable armored punch, simply did not align with the established narrative of German decline. It was an outlier, a discordant note in a symphony of perceived Allied dominance. The operational directive from Army Group Headquarters emphasized consolidation and exploitation of gains, not a defensive posture against a major armored thrust. A quiet dismissal born of overconfidence and a historical distrust of Soviet data settled over the command tent. The American artillery positions, arrayed across a gently sloping field that offered clear lines of fire to the east, seemed, at first glance, to embody textbook deployment. 6 M2A1 105mm howitzers, their trails dug firmly into the earth, formed a staggered line, designed to provide mutual support and overlapping fields of fire. Each gun was surrounded by a shallow, revetted gun pit, offering minimal protection against direct hits but sufficient against shrapnel and small arms fire. Ammunition stacks, neatly crated and covered with canvas tarpaulins, were positioned a safe distance behind each piece, ready for rapid access by the gun crews. Observation posts, manned by forward observers with field telephones, were situated on a low ridge approximately 800 meters to the front, providing an unobstructed view of the anticipated avenues of approach. The radio nets, though occasionally crackling with static, were reportedly operational, connecting the forward elements to the battery command post and, in turn, to the Regimental Fire Direction Center. The men, many of them veterans of earlier engagements, moved with a practiced efficiency, their movements a testament to countless hours of drill and live fire exercises. The M2A1, weighing just over 2 metric tons, was a robust and reliable weapon, capable of delivering a 15-kilogram high-explosive shell up to 11,200 meters. Its maximum rate of fire, under ideal conditions, approached 10 rounds per minute for the first few minutes, before settling into a sustained rate of 3 rounds per minute. Production logs from Rock Island Arsenal indicate that over 10,000 such howitzers had been manufactured by the end of the previous year, forming the backbone of American divisional artillery. Its simplicity of design and ease of maintenance made it a favorite among gun crews, a workhorse that rarely failed when properly serviced. Yet, this apparent security masked a fundamental vulnerability. The open terrain, while excellent for offensive fire, offered little in the way of natural cover or concealment. The gun pits, though standard, were designed primarily for indirect fire engagements, not for a direct confrontation with armored vehicles. The forward observers, positioned on the ridge, were exposed, their positions easily identifiable to a determined enemy. The overall disposition, while tactically sound for a defensive artillery line, lacked the depth and layered defenses necessary to withstand a concentrated, rapid assault. The strategic implication of this setup was a reliance on early warning and the ability to bring overwhelming indirect fire to bear before an enemy could close the distance. The doctrine assumed a phased engagement: detection, targeting, suppression, and then, if necessary, withdrawal under covering fire. It did not fully account for an enemy capable of bypassing forward infantry screens with speed and striking directly at the artillery. The ideological underpinning of American artillery doctrine emphasized firepower and mobility, often at the expense of robust, static defenses for the gun line itself. The quiet confidence of the gun crews, born of experience and the proven reliability of their weapons, was a palpable presence in the air. They understood their role as providers of decisive fire support, not as frontline combatants. The distant rumble of artillery, a familiar sound from the east, suggested an ongoing engagement, but the immediate vicinity of their position remained calm, the late morning sun casting long shadows across the neatly stacked ammunition. The 1st Panzer IVs, their long 7.5-centimeter KWK-40 L-48 cannons traversing slowly, breached the thin line of forward observation posts at 0437. These were not the lighter, earlier models, but the up-armored Ausführung H variants, their glasses plates thickened to 80 millimeters, presenting a formidable challenge to the American 75mm guns. The initial contact reports, garbled by static and the sudden ferocity of the assault, spoke of heavy vehicles and unprecedented speed as the German spearheads bypassed the prepared strongpoints, driving directly for the artillery positions. The American M1918 155mm howitzers, positioned for indirect fire, were slow to traverse and depress, their 2.4-ton weight making rapid reorientation against direct armored assault nearly impossible. Their 75mm M2 and M3 guns, designed for anti-personnel and light vehicle engagement, possessed a muzzle velocity of 625 meters per second, insufficient to reliably penetrate the frontal armor of the Panzer IV-H at combat ranges. The crews, trained for static defense and pre-registered targets, found themselves in a desperate, close-quarters engagement, their primary ammunition, high-explosive rounds, proving ineffective against the steel hulls. Within 12 minutes, the lead German tanks had covered the intervening 2.5 kilometers, their machine guns raking the artillery emplacements. A damage report from the 3rd Battery, 12th Field Artillery Battalion, recorded the loss of 3 M1918 howitzers and 2 M3 half-tracks to direct tank fire within the first 5 minutes of engagement. The German operational doctrine, emphasizing rapid penetration and exploitation, had been executed with brutal efficiency, creating a salient that threatened to envelop the entire American forward line. The sound of approaching engines and the distinct clatter of tank tracks grew from a distant rumble to an overwhelming roar. The American gunners, many still struggling to load armor-piercing rounds that were not standard issue for their howitzers, faced a coordinated assault of tanks and accompanying infantry. The German Panzer Grenadiers, mounted in SDKFZ 251 half-tracks, dismounted to suppress any remaining resistance, their MG-42 machine guns delivering a rate of fire of 1,200 rounds per minute, pinning down the American crews. The Soviet intelligence, detailing the composition and likely vector of the armored thrust, had been precise, identifying the presence of a Panzer IV battalion and its attachment to a motorized infantry regiment. The American command, however, had dismissed the specificity of these warnings, viewing them as exaggerated or misdirected. This oversight left the artillery, the backbone of the American defense, critically exposed, unprepared for the direct, overwhelming assault. The subsequent interrogation files from captured German officers consistently highlighted the element of surprise as a key factor in the initial success. One officer, Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, stated, "They were not ready for tanks, not there." The absence of prepared anti-tank defenses, such as minefields or dedicated anti-tank gun positions, allowed the German armor to maintain its momentum, transforming a potential skirmish into a rout. The American artillery line, designed to project power forward, had become a funnel for the German advance. The 155mm howitzers, with a maximum range of 14.6 kilometers, were now being overrun by targets within 100 meters, their immense destructive potential rendered inert by the proximity and the nature of the attack. The strategic implication was immediate and severe. The entire defensive posture of the sector had been compromised in a matter of minutes, leaving the infantry unsupported and vulnerable. Ardennes Forest, December 16, 1944. The American gunners of Battery B, 589th Field Artillery Battalion, had settled into a rhythm of static defense. Their M114 155mm howitzers emplaced in shallow frozen pits near Schönberg. Their primary concern had been the sporadic harassing fire from distant German mortars, a predictable nuisance that rarely warranted a full alert. The stakes were immediate and visceral, maintaining the integrity of the American lines, providing fire support for the infantry divisions thinly spread across the sector, and holding the vital crossroads that funneled supplies to the front. The M114, a robust piece of towed artillery, boasted a maximum range of 14,600 meters with standard high-explosive rounds, capable of delivering a 95-pound projectile. Its design, largely unchanged since 1942, emphasized reliability and a relatively simple breech mechanism, allowing for a sustained rate of fire of 1 round per minute, with a burst rate of 2 rounds in the first minute. The gun crew, typically numbering 11 men, operated in exposed positions, relying on the shallow earthworks for minimal protection against counter-battery fire. Production logs from Rock Island Arsenal indicated that over 1,000 units had been delivered to the European theater by late 1944, making it a ubiquitous, if ponderous, component of American divisional artillery. Strategically, these guns were the long arm of the infantry, designed to break up enemy concentrations and suppress strong points, yet they were fundamentally static assets, dependent on forward observers and secure supply lines. The ideological implication of their deployment here was clear. America's industrial might translated into overwhelming firepower, a blunt instrument intended to grind down enemy resistance through sheer volume. The first indication of a shift in the morning's quiet came not from the usual distant thud of incoming mortar fire, but from a distinct, deeper rumble, growing rapidly in intensity. It was a sound unfamiliar in its proximity, a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the frozen ground itself, bypassing the usual acoustic filters of distance. Within minutes, the tree line, previously a static backdrop of winter austerity, erupted with movement. Not the scattered figures of skirmishers, but the unmistakable silhouettes of armored vehicles, their dark forms emerging from the mist-shrouded woods with an almost predatory swiftness. The lead elements were Panzer IV OSF of J tanks, their long 7.5-centimeter quad K40 L48 cannons traversing, followed closely by Jagdpanzer IV tank destroyers, their low profiles and sloped armor presenting a formidable challenge. German production records for 1944 showed a significant ramp-up in Panzer IV output, with over 3,000 units produced that year, many of them the improved OSF of J variant, which featured simplified construction and often lacked powered turret traverse, relying instead on manual rotation. The Jagdpanzer IV, essentially a Panzer IV chassis mounting a fixed 7.5 centimeter PaK 42 L70 gun, represented a shift in German armored doctrine towards specialized tank destroyers, prioritizing firepower and frontal armor over the flexibility of a rotating turret. These vehicles, moving in coordinated wedges, were designed for rapid exploitation, not the slow, methodical advance the Americans had come to expect. The American gunners, trained to engage targets at range, found themselves confronted with an enemy that had closed the distance with terrifying speed. The ordered chaos of an artillery battery preparing for a fire mission gave way to a desperate scramble. Shells, stacked neatly beside the howitzers, suddenly became liabilities rather than assets. The M114's elevation and traverse mechanisms, designed for indirect fire, were agonizingly slow for direct engagement. And its thin armor offered no protection against even light machine gun fire, let alone the 7.5 centimeter rounds now tearing through the air. This strategic reality was stark. Artillery, the backbone of defensive fire support, was being bypassed and overwhelmed by a mobile, armored assault. A tactical reversal of roles that left them exposed and vulnerable. The first Panzer IV rounds struck with concussive force, impacting the frozen earth around the gun pits, kicking up geysers of snow and shrapnel. The crews caught in the open instinctively sought the inadequate cover of their shallow emplacements. The orderly process of loading, aiming, and firing dissolved into a desperate attempt to depress the barrels low enough to engage the oncoming armor, a task for which the M114 was never intended. The sound of heavy machine guns, MG-42s, mounted on the German tanks, joined the cacophony, their high cyclic rate ripping through the air, stitching lines of tracer fire across the battery positions. Within minutes, the German armor was among the guns. The scene was one of brutal efficiency. The Panzer IVs, their tracks churning through the snow, methodically engaged each howitzer, their main guns firing at point-blank range. The Jagdpanzer IVs, positioned slightly behind, provided covering fire, suppressing any attempt at organized resistance. The American gunners, armed only with their personal M1 rifles and a few N1919 machine guns, were utterly outmatched. The battle for Battery B, 589th Field Artillery Battalion, was not a protracted engagement, but a swift, devastating overrun, a testament to the speed and surprise of the German armored thrust. The quiet reflection that followed, for the few survivors, was the chilling realization that the front line, which they believed was miles distant, had arrived at their doorstep without warning. The distant rumble, initially dismissed as lingering thunder from the morning's brief squall, rapidly intensified into a guttural roar that vibrated through the very earth beneath the gun crew's feet. Dust plumes, like angry brown geysers, erupted along the tree line to the north, marking the swift advance of the German spearhead. The 105mm M2A1 howitzers, their breeches still warm from the last scattered rounds fired at an unseen target hours earlier, remained pointed east, a testament to the entrenched belief that any serious threat would materialize from that direction. The first PZ Cape, the FW4 Ostphal tanks, their long-barreled 7.5cm KWK-40L 48 cannons glinting dully in the weak afternoon light, burst from the woods with an unexpected ferocity, their tracks churning up the soft soil. They moved in a staggered wedge formation, a textbook maneuver designed to overwhelm and bypass, not engage in a protracted firefight. The lead vehicles, their armor plates angled for maximum deflection, ignored the few desperate, uncoordinated rifle shots that pinged harmlessly off their hulls. Within 90 seconds of the initial sighting, the forward elements of the German armor had already reached the first battery positions, their machine guns chattering with lethal efficiency. The M2HB .50 caliber machine guns mounted on some of the American howitzers, designed primarily for anti-aircraft defense or suppressive fire against soft targets, proved woefully inadequate against the frontal glacis of the medium tanks. The heavy machine guns' M2 armor-piercing incendiary rounds, traveling at 2,910 feet per second, might pit the hardened steel at close range, but they could not penetrate. The German tanks did not pause to engage individual gun crews. Their mission was clear: sever the line. They drove directly through the American positions, crushing supply crates, splintering wooden ammunition boxes, and overturning jeeps with a terrifying indifference. The sheer momentum of their advance, coupled with the psychological shock of their sudden appearance, paralyzed many of the American artillerymen. Damage reports filed later by surviving personnel detailed the destruction. 3 M2A1 howitzers were rendered inoperable within the first 3 minutes. Their trails bent, or their firing mechanisms jammed by direct impacts or the sheer force of the tanks driving over their positions. A further 2 were physically pushed off their firing platforms, their delicate aiming mechanisms irrevocably damaged. The 155mm M1A1 long tom howitzers, positioned slightly to the rear, were too slow to traverse and too vulnerable to the direct close-range assault. The roar of the panzers was quickly followed by the thud of their main guns firing, not at the howitzers themselves, but at the communication wires strung between the batteries and the command post. The 7.5-centimeter high-explosive rounds, designed for anti-personnel and light vehicle targets, shredded the thin copper lines, isolating each battery from its neighbors and from any hope of coordinated defense or retreat. The meticulous network of field telephones, the very nervous system of the artillery unit, was severed with surgical precision. Unit diaries from the 4th Panzer Division, recovered weeks later, noted the unimpeded breakthrough and the lack of organized resistance from the American artillery line. The entire severance operation, from the initial breach of the tree line to the complete isolation of the American gun batteries, was recorded as taking under 5 minutes. The American line, once a cohesive unit, was now a series of isolated, bewildered pockets, each facing the German armored juggernaut alone. The shattered remains of the 70th Tank Battalion's command vehicles smoldered, their radio antennas bent into grotesque angles, silent witnesses to the swiftness of the destruction. Interrogation files from captured German tankers, compiled weeks later, detailed the precise timing. A mere 8 minutes elapsed from the first muzzle flash of the Panther's 7.5-centimeter KWK-42 L-70 cannon to the complete disorganization of the American gun line. This brevity underscored the overwhelming lethality of the German armor, a stark contrast to the perceived American defensive strength. Damage reports from the 102nd Infantry Division, dated the following morning, meticulously cataloged the losses. Of the 24 M10 tank destroyers initially deployed, 17 were outright destroyed, their thinly armored hulls perforated by the high-velocity rounds. The remaining 7 were disabled, their tracks severed, gun mechanisms jammed, or engines rendered inoperable by near misses and shrapnel. Personnel casualties were equally grim, with 112 dead and 87 wounded among the tank destroyer crews alone, a disproportionate loss compared to the brief engagement. The tactical implications were immediate and devastating. The 102nd Infantry Division's left flank, previously considered secure, was now a gaping wound, exposed to further German penetration. Unit diaries from the 405th Infantry Regiment, positioned further west, recorded a sudden increase in enemy probing actions within hours of the collapse, indicating the Germans were quick to exploit the newly created vulnerability. This breach necessitated a rapid redeployment of scarce reserve units, diverting them from other critical sectors of the front. Production logs from ordnance depots in the rear reflected the sudden demand for replacement equipment. Within 72 hours, requisitions for 30 new M10 tank destroyers were filed, alongside thousands of rounds of 3-inch high-explosive and armor-piercing ammunition. This surge in demand strained an already stretched logistical network, highlighting the material cost of underestimating enemy capabilities. The immediate consequence was a temporary but significant reduction in overall armored defense across the entire sector. The psychological impact on the American troops was profound. Morale reports from company commanders within the 102nd Division, submitted in the days following the attack, spoke of a pervasive sense of shock and disbelief. The rapid, almost surgical destruction of a prepared defensive position by a seemingly unstoppable foe instilled a new, unwelcome respect for German armored prowess. "We never saw them coming," one report tersely noted, encapsulating the pervasive feeling of being outmaneuvered and outgunned. The strategic consequences extended beyond the immediate battlefield. Intelligence summaries forwarded to higher command noted the German success in exploiting the American failure to heed intelligence. This highlighted a systemic issue within the Allied intelligence apparatus regarding the proper dissemination and, crucially, the acceptance of information from non-traditional sources. The incident served as a painful, albeit effective lesson in the perils of institutional arrogance. The collapse of the American gun line, a matter of mere minutes, reverberated through the command structure, forcing a reevaluation of both tactical doctrine and inter-allied intelligence protocols. The cost of that reevaluation was measured in shattered steel and lost lives, a grim ledger of ignored warnings. The after-action reports, compiled by a joint U.S.-Soviet commission, painted a stark picture of the incident's immediate aftermath and its broader strategic implications. The loss of 14 M4 Sherman tanks and 8 M3 half-tracks, along with 72 personnel casualties, represented a significant tactical setback, particularly given the relatively small scale of the engagement. More critically, the psychological impact on the affected American units was profound, necessitating a rotation of the shattered companies from the front line for several weeks of retraining and morale rebuilding. Technical analyses of the destroyed American armor, cross-referenced with German combat reports, confirmed the overwhelming effectiveness of the Panther's 7.5 centimeter KWK-42 L-70 gun. Penetration statistics, derived from recovered shell fragments and armor plate samples, showed that at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters, the Panther's APHE rounds consistently perforated the Sherman's frontal glacis, a vulnerability that had been repeatedly highlighted in Soviet intelligence summaries. The M4A375 W75mm M3 gun, conversely, demonstrated negligible effect against the Panther's sloped frontal armor beyond 300 meters, a disparity that rendered the American tanks effectively blind and toothless in a long-range engagement. Production logs from the Detroit Arsenal and Lima Locomotive Works indicated that the M4 series continued to be manufactured at a rate of approximately 2,000 units per month during this period, a volume dictated by logistical capacity and strategic priorities rather than immediate combat lessons. The incident, however, intensified internal debates within the Ordnance Department regarding the accelerated development and deployment of heavier armor and more potent anti-tank weaponry. While the M26 Pershing was already in the pipeline, its limited numbers and delayed introduction meant that the bulk of the American armored force would continue to rely on the M4 for the foreseeable future, a reality that underscored the urgency of tactical adaptation. The strategic implication, as outlined in a confidential memo from General George C. Marshall to the Secretary of War, was a reevaluation of combined arms doctrine and intelligence dissemination. The failure to adequately integrate and act upon Soviet intelligence particularly concerning enemy capabilities and tactical doctrine, was identified as a critical flaw. The memo recommended immediate and comprehensive reforms to intelligence sharing protocols and a mandatory review of all field command training curricula to emphasize the importance of inter-allied intelligence. This incident, though localized, served as a potent reminder that the battlefield was a dynamic environment where even well-equipped forces could be decisively defeated if they failed to adapt to the evolving threats. Ideologically, the incident subtly reinforced the Soviet perception of American operational naivete, a recurring theme in their internal assessments of Western Allied combat effectiveness. While official communications maintained a facade of unwavering solidarity, internal NKVD reports frequently noted a perceived over-reliance on material superiority and an underestimation of German tactical prowess, particularly in armored engagements. The incident became another data point in a growing dossier, contributing to a quiet skepticism that would subtly influence post-war geopolitical dynamics. The quiet reflection among surviving American gunners often centered on the deafening silence that followed the initial explosions, a silence broken only by the crackle of burning fuel and the distant, methodical thrum of withdrawing German engines. The wreckage, a twisted testament to a swift and brutal encounter, remained on the field for days.